Okay, so today what I'm going to do is walk you through a few slides that we ordinarily would have gone through in class, probably with a guest speaker. But, the things are the way that they are, so we're going to make the best of them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into my presentation here, and hopefully you can now see that come up. And so this is going to be all about sort of the legal aspects of entrepreneurship. Now, take into consideration, you'd probably take 3 years of law school in order to wrap your head around even just like sort of one corner of law, and you'd really get your experience, as a practicing attorney working in a firm or something like that. So this is going to be very, very much surface level. But what we're going to do is we're going to start off by talking about business structures. You probably heard out throughout this year I was talking about LLCs, and so we're going to try to put into context what that means, and then also identify several other business structures that exist. This is not all-encompassing, but I think it will provide you with a good overview of what they are and why they exist. So for starters, operating a business is risky. We live in a very litigious society. That means that people sue each other all the time, sometimes not with good reason. And if you do get sued by somebody, even if they don't have a good reason, it's still incumbent upon you to defend yourself in a court of law, and that can take a lot of time and money, which are two of the most valuable resources that you have as an entrepreneur. Things can happen, things get stolen, accidents happen, fires, lawsuits, disputes with fellow owners, and so on and so forth. So the structure of your business, the legal structure of your business, can impact the impact of those things that could potentially happen. So we're going to look through some different types of business structures that exist. Today, there are other ones, but we're going to look at sole proprietorships. We're actually going to probably skip partnerships, but that's okay. We're going to look at corporations, and then we're going to look more closely at limited liability companies, or LLCs, because that's probably the most common business structure for entrepreneurs. So for starters, if you are conducting business, if you're mowing lawns, if you're tutoring somebody, if you're doing anything where you're exchanging a good or service for money, like, you are by default a sole proprietor. That is like the default state, and you don't have to do anything. That's just what you are when you are conducting business of any sort. There's no cost, and there's nothing that you really have to do. There's no formalities, and so legally, you're a sole proprietor if you don't do anything else. The sort of negative aspect of this is that there's unlimited personal liability for what you're doing. So if you injure somebody in the course of conducting your business, in the eyes of the law, there's no difference between you, the business, and then you, the individual. So if somebody sues you for something that you did while conducting your business, they could go after all of your personal assets. And so if you're a homeowner, if you have a car, if you've got money saved in the bank, then they could go after everything that you are worth. And so that's really the reason that businesses form into these legal entities, these structures like a corporation. And so corporations are formed under state law, and what it does is it creates what's called a corporate shield, where it separates the business in the eyes of the law from the individual. And so it's sort of like a separate entity. And so the reason that you want to do that is, especially if you're doing something risky, let's say that you are you rent moon bounces, inflatable moon bounces that people rent for parties, and somebody breaks their neck. Well, there's a difference between the business's assets and then your personal assets. Hopefully that doesn't happen, obviously. But the individual would sue the business, and they couldn't go after your personal belongings. And so it's a way to mitigate the risk of operating a business because the liability is sort of shielded through these legal business entities. Now, there's a lot of formalities, and there's also this tax issue, and you probably hear about this in the news a lot. Tax issues related to businesses. And so if you're running a business, the business itself gets taxed, and so does the individual from the earnings that they get in, what they pay themselves from the earnings of the business. And so there's this double taxation, which is sometimes not very appealing, especially depending upon if you're running, depending on what type of business you're running. There's also a lot of formalities, and sometimes a corporation is too complex or more complex than a lot of businesses need, which leads us to this limited liability company, or LLC, which also is filed under state law. And basically what this does is it sort of takes the best parts of a sole proprietorship. It's relatively easy to set up. It's relatively inexpensive to set up. It's not terribly complicated to run, but it does still have this corporate shield where it's going to differentiate your personal ownings from, or personal assets, your personal worth from that of the business. It's what's referred to as a pass-through entity. And so when we're talking about these legal business entities, we're also talking about sort of the tax implications. And so we talked about how the corporations have this double taxation issue. Well, the earnings are passed through to your personal income, and so you just report that as income as if you were, a salaried employee. It can be a little bit more complex in certain situations, but the LLC is probably the most popular way to go for startups. Now, I want to share a couple of resources. I think I have this pulled up right here. In Illinois, you simply just go to the cyberdriveillinois.com, which is the Secretary of State's website, and you can file this online, and it costs like $150, $100 expedited fee, so like $250 in order to basically form an LLC overnight. Relatively simple to do. You could also do it with a paper copy. This is what the file looks like right here. It's 2 pages. It's not terribly complicated, and it allows you to form multi-member LLCs or single-member LLCs. And I don't want to get into the weeds of things, but basically an LLC is a good way to go if you're wanting to start a business. Let me hop back into the presentation mode here, and we're going to keep on going into our next category of legal discussion, which is IP, or intellectual property. And so again, you could spend 3 years and then specialize and become an expert in this field after you've graduated high school, after you've gone to college. And so again, just sort of skimming the surface here, but we're going to talk about several different types of intellectual property: trade secrets, design patents, utility patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade names. And so each of these things protect different things, but there can be some overlap, and sometimes they sort of mutually reinforce each other, sort of like making sure that you're protecting your the value of your business if you are sort of in the knowledge work area, or if there's something about your business, whether it's a good that you're creating or a service that you're operating that has some sort of secret sauce that if somebody else knew or was able to replicate, it would sort of run you out of business. So we're going to look at what a trade secret is. And so a trade secret is an interesting form of intellectual property protection because it's sort of like the opposite of a formal form of protection. It's literally a secret. Now, patents, as we're going to look at in a second, they expire. A utility patent expires after 20 years, then a design patent can expire after 14 years. And so if you were to try to patent like the recipe for Coca-Cola, well, that would become public domain knowledge, and then anybody could literally make Coca-Cola and just put a different name on it. And so Coke, they protect their recipe by just literally keeping it a secret, and they call it a trade secret in that regard. All right, a copyright is basically a form of protection for any sort of like written work, and so that can include like a movie script. That can include if you wrote a book or a poem or a song. It can even include software. And by default, if you write something, it is copywritten. Like, you don't really have to do anything technically. The problem is it becomes more difficult to prove that you wrote it when you wrote it, and so sometimes you want to go through like the proper channels of actually copywriting something and sort of filing with the government so that they recognize it as such. A trademark, there's actually two categories here. There's a trademark and then a service mark. And in sort of common usage, trademark is the term that is used to describe both. But it's basically like a brand name, a slogan, or a logo. And so, Apple would be a word that you couldn't trademark in let's say like if you were selling fruit, because like it's a common usage word, it's an obvious word, so not all words can be used or can be trademarked, but in the context of a technology company, it's not obvious. And so Apple is able, the computer company, they are able, the technology company, they're able to trademark that word because it, in its context, is unique and not obvious. All right, now we're getting into patents. We're going to look at utility patents first. I'm going to read the definition right here, which is an invention of a new and useful process, machine, manufacture, or composition of matter, or a new and useful improvement thereof. So a utility patent is sort of like the traditional, definition of patent, or maybe not traditional, but it's sort of like what most people think of when they think of what a patent is. Like if you invent a new thing or a new way to do something, then you can have the exclusive rights to do that thing, or to use that thing, or to sell that thing for up to 20 years from the date that a patent is filed. Now, there are all sorts of things that you can sort of dive into in terms of like a provisional patent, which gives you about a year's worth of time to determine whether or not you want to patent it. So sort of like it holds your permission to patent something. But if you start selling something, and you don't get a provisional patent within a year, then like it's no longer patentable. And so this is a really complicated, area of law. And a lot of times you're going to talk to attorneys, and they'll say like, I practice in almost every area of law except for patents. It's this like highly specialized thing that's really complicated, and it's not cheap. We had a group in the incubator class a couple of years ago that got a provisional patent, and it cost about $2,000 just to get the provisional patent, and that was like a discounted rate because it was a friend of the class, and it was like $500 to just do an initial patent search to find out whether or not this could be patented, and the provisional patent gave us a year's worth of time to determine if we wanted to pursue the full patent, which again at the discounted rate would have been like $10,000 to $20,000. So patents are sort of complicated area. In our class, a lot of times, we wrestle with this question: do we want to protect this? Or do we want to just sort of like go forward and try to start selling the thing? One thing that happens a lot of times is somebody violates or infringes upon your patent, but then again, it's up to you to go and sue that individual, and exercise the rights that your patent affords you, and that takes time and money, and so it gets really complicated pretty quickly. One other form of patent is a design patent, and so these patents cover the ornamental, non-functional design of an item. And so like Samsung and Apple have been having like this big old debate because one of the companies has claimed like the form factor of the mobile phone with like the rounded rectangle, and that has caused a lot of friction, and it's given attorneys a lot of reason to argue for a long time. And so again, these are utility patents essentially. So it's like the design of something can be protected by a patent. So this is sort of another example that I was just saying is like one of the companies has this patent, but the other one is still using something that's very similar. So it's sort of like difficult to determine when are they violating it or are they not violating it? And the other thing is like these only last for 14 years. So we had a group this year that actually invented a project independently of somebody else who had already invented it like 20 years prior. So that patent had expired, and so they were free to use this idea even though it had been patented. All right, so that was a lot to cover in just 5 to 10 minutes, and clearly this is a really deep and interesting area that you could dive into, seemingly forever. And so what we're going to do right now is sort of leave it at that and sort of understand that this is just like a very surface level, exploration of matters related to law, and know that there's a lot more that you could learn. But sort of the key takeaways are that you want to think about how you can protect your ideas so that somebody else can't take them, and then how can you protect yourself from the liability of running your business, or protect yourself from the risk associated with running your business by using business structures like LLCs in order to give yourself that corporate shield. Okay, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.